We just got an incredible view of the sun. This view is from the ESA solar orbiter, and it was recorded in extreme ultraviolet light. This video takes us from the sun's lower atmosphere to the upper atmosphere, the corona. In this video, you can see structures on the sun's visible surface that make it look fuzzy. This is charged gas or plasma that's connected by magnetic field lines to the interior of the sun. In the lower left corner, there's what's called coronal moss. This probably is the base of a coronal loop that's too hot to be seen with these camera settings. At the bumps you can see on the horizon of the sun, these are called spicules and they're from the chromosphere. They can be 10,000 kilometers or 6,200 miles high. The eruption you can see is larger than the Earth. You can also see coronal rain that is darker than what surrounds it. That's because it's cooler. The bright spots are hotter, around 1,000,000 degrees Celsius or 1.8 million degrees Fahrenheit, while the darker areas are cooler, relatively speaking, of course. The rain is made of high-density plasma that falls back onto the sun.